and I was there before now. Thank you very much, sir. And so, the topic that Mr. Aderinwale is supposed to speak to is, can private sector promote national interest in Nigeria? And then I asked him, is it can, or how has the private sector promoted national interest? Because truth be told, um, the major support of our economy in Nigeria is the private sector, unless we want to deceive ourselves. Right from the gate of Unilag, we have been seeing third fund. We have been seeing privately named buildings, and we know how they are funded. We know that third fund, ever since the setup of third fund, they have never declared a loss. And that's a reflection of the private sector, because 2% of every company's profit goes into funding third fund. And so I think that the private sector needs to be more appreciated for doing that. We've also seen the 2025 budget. The 2025 budget that has just been presented, I mean, unless we want to deceive ourselves, we know that it's going to be privately funded. If the government is saying that they are going to be making so amount from tax, it's the private sector that's going to pay it. Excise duty is the private sector. If they're talking about infrastructure, we know it's the private sector. They're talking about agri, human capital development, revenue generation, everything. 47.9 trillion uh, budget of Nigeria is going to be funded by the private sector. We can tell ourselves that it's a crude oil that we are going to be relying on. But let's look ourselves in the face and agree that the coming into the energy space of Dangote has changed the narratives. And so private sector is actually driving the interests of Nigeria at the moment. That's my personal opinion. And so I asked Mr. Aderinwale, I said, can we now say how? Or can we now say can or how? I think it's how. I mean, if we're talking about aligning business objectives with national development goals, we see the private sector there. Promoting sustainable development, all the SDG goals, is the private sector. Fostering innovation and entrepreneurship, it's private sector. Collaborating with the government in so many areas, private sector. Demonstrating good corporate governance, private sector. Public sector organizations, you still see a situation whereby the CEO is also the chairman of the board. It's a very bad practice. But it doesn't happen in the private sector. We still have it in EFCC, we have it in ICPC, and that's why there are issues with those organizations at the moment. I think I've digressed from Mr. Aderinwale's presentation. I'm not going to take too much of our time. I'm not going to pretend to be an academic. I'm just going to speak like somebody who is representing one of the mentees of the selling point. He actually has a paper, but I'm just going to pick some points from it. He took the liberty to actually tell us what his own opinion of private sector is. He said the private sector, properly understood, is an amalgam of disparate interests, bodies, and entities. It's a coinage of sorts. It at once covers from the fellows ugly dog chains in traffic to humongous entities like the inimitable Dangote Industries, all the way to the Chinese involved in Galamse in Ifewara, his village, wreaking havoc in the name of gold mining. The part of the private sector that we're talking about. It encompasses various industries, companies, and entities that operate independently of the government to generate profits, create jobs independently of the government, provide goods and services for the country. Well, in Nigeria, it is common to divide the private sector into two broad categories. We are all guilty of that. We call it the formal and the informal sector. At times, the so-called formal sector is also adoringly called the organized private sector, thus suggesting that the informal sector, which contributes 57.4% of the GDP, is disorganized, or at best, unorganized. Well, the important point to note at this juncture is the contribution of the informal sector in the wealth creation space. 57.4% is not small. Whether formal or informal, organized or not, private sector, we agree that they have the following idiosyncrasies: private ownership, there's private motive, there's autonomy, And in most cases, competition, we expect that there should be competition, but we know that there are some private organizations, state actors who claim to be private organizations, but we know that they are fronting for government, and so they have created monopoly, the so-called private sector. He also tried to apply the myth to the context of private sector promotion, as a mentee of Prof. I think Mr. Aderinwale tried to also play into the academic space, trying to justify what you have taught him. He said, in the myth of Erectus, who was tasked with slaying the Leonard Hydra, a serpent-like monster with multiple heads that can regenerate its heads if any are cut off. Hercules soon realizes that he cannot defeat the Hydra alone and enlists the help of his charioteer, Eolaus. Did I get that right, sir? So together they devise a strategy where Hercules cuts off the Hydra's head and Aulus cauterizes the wound with a torch to prevent new heads from growing. Through their collaborative efforts, they successfully defeat the Hydra. So now he's applying this myth to the context of private sector promotion of national interest, and that's where I will end. It says that Hercules is the private sector. Representing the private sector, it symbolizes the strength, expertise, and resources that businesses can bring to the table. Then Aulus, representing the government, provides a framework, policies, and support necessary for the private sector to thrive. And then the Hydra is representing the national challenge. It embodies the complex, interconnected challenges that nations face, such as economic development, infrastructure, education, and healthcare. In this analogy, the private sector, that's Hercules, and the government, that is Chariot, collaborate to tackle national challenges, which is the Hydra. To that extent, it shows that national interest defies of a monolithic ascription. It is a collective responsibility between the public and the private sector. So, he's saying that what do idiots like Professor Badi just say concerning this? I will turn to Nobel laureates in economics, some of them who have significantly shaped our understanding of national interest, vis-a-vis economic systems and policies. For instance, Paul Krugman's work on international trade and economic geography highlights the importance of competitive advantage and innovation in driving economic growth. One salient point that Mr. Aderinwale pointed out in his paper, which I also agree, is the fact that there is actually a problem that is mitigating against the success of the private sector being able to continue to promote national interest, and that's poverty and insecurity. And it persists that for us to be able to defeat this, we should stop looking at poverty and insecurity as an economic policy. Rather, we should look at it, we should address it as a strategy, not as a policy. If it is adopted as a strategy and not a policy where you do a box ticking process, rather you bring the actors to the table and we all agree that this is how to handle this headlong, then we are not going together. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity. Happy birthday.